Welcome to the Cannabis Cultivation and Science Podcast. I'm your host, Tad Hussey of Kiss Organics. This is the podcast where we discuss the cutting edge of growing from a science-based perspective and draw on top experts from around the industry to share their wisdom and knowledge. I've got some exciting updates from Kiss Organics. We've expanded our IPM lineup and are now official distributors for Bioworks, which means we can offer products like EpiShield, Sufoil X, Root Shield, Principle, Cease, Millstop, and much more. Plus, I have direct access to their pathologists and horticultural team if any commercial growers want to connect. We've also added heavy metal testing through our partnership with Cannabis Chem Lab. It's ISO accredited, covers soil, water, fertilizer, and plant material, and costs only $99 per test, making it the most affordable option out there. But my guest this week is Bryant Mason. I've had Bryant on the podcast a few times in the past, and he's one of my all-time favorite guests. Bryant is a certified crop advisor who specializes in organic cannabis nutrition. He has spent the last 9 years working to combine precision laboratory techniques with data science in an effort to unravel the complexities of cannabis soil and crop nutrition. Along with his work on soilless media, he also helps outdoor growers around the United States with nutrient management and cover cropping. If you would like to do soil testing, help interpreting a soil test, or are interested in an online course on these subjects, his website is www.soildoctorconsulting.com. And if you want to save $100 on his course, you can use the discount code KIS Organics, all one word. I've taken his course and was recently going back to review some content. It's excellent, and I highly recommend it for anyone wanting to do a deep dive on cannabis fertility and reusing your soil. Now on to the show. Hey, Bryant, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Tad. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear what you've been up to. It's been a little while since we last talked, and I always really enjoy our conversations. So, yeah, I figure, we didn't prepare for this conversation. We're just going to talk about what's been on your mind lately and see where it goes. So, yeah, please do share. What have you been up to lately? What are you most excited about these days?
Sure. Well, I'm always thinking about a lot. I'd say that there are a couple themes of this growing season for me. The first I mentioned to you before the podcast, I've been working on building a low-tech autonomous greenhouse. It's not fully autonomous. We still have to plant and harvest, but the irrigation, the ventilation, the humidification is all automated. We've installed a lot of diffusion materials and are really trying to create the effect of a sort of mid to high tech greenhouse using low tech materials on a tight budget. Most of it involves automation and programming, and so we've done that with the use of multiple sensors. And we think we can actually do it with really low cost Arduinos. There's technically a Raspberry Pi, if you've heard of that. It's about a $50 piece of hardware that is going to take care of the automation of the entire greenhouse. But it's a low-tech greenhouse, so it's like roll-up sidewalls on a $100 motor from Amazon. It's soil sensors at various depths that trigger a solenoid that turns the irrigation on and off to maintain a specific soil moisture. There's a humidification system, and we're actually not using specific temperature and humidity set points. We're determining that the set points are floating based on the leaf VPD. So we have an infrared camera that is taking leaf temperature measurements, calculating a VPD, and then the temperature and the humidity are actually set based on that, and various other things. So it's been fun. It's been a fun challenge. And the entire greenhouse industry is sort of built on, high-tech greenhouses, large operations. So we're trying to do it in a small space, bring it back down on a more budget level. So that's been fun. And then, of course, I told you about this. I had a big peach harvest about a month ago. So that took up a lot of time this season as well.
Yeah. I was sad to miss you at the conference this year. Our first Cannabis Cultivation and Science Conference. You were one of the first people I reached out to when we announced it. But if we do it again next year, I already gave you the dates of the last weekend in August. I think you set those aside. So, assuming everything goes as planned, we'll host it again and have you out, which would be phenomenal.
Great. Yeah, I've got on my calendar the August 28th through the 30th. So I should be there. It's a long way away,
Awesome.
but I should be there.
It does. It does feel a long ways away right now. But yeah, that's exciting. Um, well, I'll be honest. I don't know that I can add a lot to a conversation around coding and things like that. For those of you that can see my screen, I just got this grow sensor. It's a cool company out of Europe, and I'm working with them to try out their new sensor. Here's their soil probe, and so I'm going to be tracking, a lot of the stuff you talked about with this sensor because it can measure leaf VPD, CO2, PAR levels, all those
So
things.
that measures leaf VPD.
It does. There's a thing underneath here at the bottom that will measure leaf VPD.
Oh yeah,
Or temperature, and then point down onto the leaf as it's sitting in your canopy.
I
So
got to
your
get the name
canopy
of
is gonna.
that, because the one sensor we haven't been able to find inexpensively is an infrared leaf temperature sensor. We went with Apogee, which
Yeah,
is $500 for just that
great
sensor.
company. Yeah, great
Yeah,
company.
no doubt.
But
I mean, they make
expensive.
amazing sensors, but if we're going low tech budget, it's not. That's research grade stuff. So that looks awesome.
Yeah, so the company is called Grow Sensor, and they actually have another product. I'll just give them a little plug here. Grow Diary that literally they're two separate products, which I didn't realize at the time. But the Grow Diary will track every metric you could ever want of your grow. It calculates VPD for you, all those things. Really, really interesting concept in a way to use technology that I think is powerful because we collect all this data, as you know, and you can just get data overload, but it doesn't do you any good unless it gives you actionable information over time. So I'm excited to see, and I'm going to share with Grow Sensor all the data I collect in my room because they haven't done these. This sort of soil moisture probe is designed to be poked into the side of a pot, and I'm going to be actually burying it. And they're going to give me a recommendation for what depth inside my bed, and I'll be tracking that along with using my Blue Lab pulse meter and my guy. I have three. I have so many options now.
You've probably got a tensiometer of some kind.
I do. I have a tensiometer from Blue Mat, and then I also have the one that you like, which I
The
haven't used yet.
earometer.
Yeah, I have an aerometer
Well,
too.
so I was
Yes.
going to say, I used to talk about those a lot. I've moved away from them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, a couple reasons. One is they require a bit of maintenance. They're totally imperfect in terms of how they function. The water dries out. Sometimes you just have bad soil contact. And I have a big enough farm where I can't run around maintaining those things. So I like to bury volumetric sensors. I've gone 100% volumetric sensors, and I have a pile of aerometers in my shop. I'm not recommending growers don't use them. I just think it's a scale issue and a maintenance issue.
Yeah, there's a lot of different ways to measure water in soil or even soilless media. And it's hard to move back and forth between all of them.
I have another, well, technically a tensiometer should be more accurate to what the plant is experiencing because it's water tension. It's how much energy it takes the roots to actually extract water, as opposed to volumetric, which it doesn't give you a sense of the actual water potential. But I have found that when the soil's moist, the aerometer, or for that matter, I used I think the Teros 21. I forgot, but a more automated water potential sensor. The issue is when the soil is moist, it just shows 0. But with a volumetric probe, I like to know how wet are we? Is it 34%? Is it 32%? And there's a lot more sensitivity on the wet end of the spectrum with volumetric probes, where a tensiometer will just tell you, wet. It'll tell you 0 kilopascals or millibars. So I sort of prefer knowing how wet I really am at different depths with the volumetric probes.
Yeah, I find I just I keep my blue map moisture meter in there in my room all the time, and I just will go in and push the button and kind of see where I'm at, and I like how easy that is.
Right.
But then if I want to take multiple readings, it's not as useful because it has to acclimate. You have to take it out, poke it in, wait a little bit before you get another reading. The pulse meter, I find, can give you, depending on where you put those two probes into the media, can give you varying results. But I love that I can get multiple readings really, really fast. But I do, I can't just walk in the room and use it. I have to open the app, which takes, it doesn't sound like much, but sometimes that pushes me towards the moisture meter because I can just push a button on the moisture meter and get a reading.
Right.
So it's
Right.
interesting. Whereas this will just passively collect data all the time. These buried sensors. And then then I'm just getting the information all the time, which I'm excited about trying out.
The other benefit of buried sensors is you can set the interval to take a reading every 2 minutes, every 3 minutes, every 4, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I get, updates at the end of the day of, it's a very good average. Let me put it that way, across an entire day when you have so many data points. The other thing is it's automated. So it just, takes that little bit of walking or time away. And then the final thing is I actually am more interested in moisture across an entire soil profile. So the problem too is if you just have one blue mat sitting 6 inches deep, that's just one spot. But what I'm really looking at is, 3 inches, depends on the crop. In my high tunnel, I'm looking at 2 inches. I'm looking at 4 inches. I'm looking at 8 inches. In my orchard, I'm looking at, 3 different depths that are deeper. And to me, that's much more interesting because you see this wild variation based on, your irrigation and precipitation patterns. So I think the ability to do multiple depths is pretty important. Also in pots, I mean, if you put one at the bottom of the pot, it's shocking the difference from the top 6 inches.
Yeah, I think it's all really pretty interesting. And I think there's a lot we still have to learn with cannabis and water management that I know you and I were talking about stress, drybacks and stress. I guess how stress or triggers impact secondary metabolite production, and watering plays such a huge role in that. I think about, how do I manage for optimal root hair health and, encourage roots to go deeper, but also not allow it to get so dry that I may have more root hair death than I want. But one of the things, I'm jumping around a little bit here, that you brought up that I think is important, because we were also talking about pH before the podcast, is this idea that we think of the soil or our media as homogeneous in our heads, but the reality of it is it's so diverse, and there's so many different micro aggregates and pockets and of microbes and fertility and all these different things happening all the time in the soil that we don't really think about, as I think of on a regular basis, as the average grower. And I think that's worth exploring a little bit in a conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about the pH chart a lot and how it's just so limiting and borderline inaccurate. And I actually have been feeling like there should be separate pH charts. There should be a separate pH chart for non-organic hydro-based growing. So for example, it says that the micronutrients are totally unavailable at high pHs. Well, not if you're using, synthetic chelates, for example. But then, there should be a separate chart for peat-based media and topsoil. Like that, the existing pH chart says that calcium is fully available at high pHs, which just isn't the case, especially if the calcium is in the form of carbonates. And so, in fact, in my soil, for example, I have a pH of 8.2 and the calcium is totally unavailable. So the pH chart in different contexts is just sort of patently false. And it's not that it's the problem isn't that it's wrong. It's that there need to be multiple pH charts for different situations. Are we talking about feed solutions? Are we talking about topsoil? Are we talking about living soil in a peat-based environment? So yeah, I think my warning to growers is I mean, your point's correct. Soil is non-homogeneous. So there's pockets of low pH, there's pockets of high pH. In a living soil system, there are acidification effects from root exudation as well as microbiology in the rhizosphere, 1 millimeter from the root hairs. So that's a thing. But the other issue is that the pH chart just isn't quite accurate in terms of truly knowing what's available from a purely chemistry standpoint. So my recommendation to living soil growers is to be less concerned with high pH. And I wouldn't say more concerned with low pH, but I definitely start to see issues in cannabis soils when pH drops below 5.5. It just, not always, but is often the case. But I rarely see issues above 7. So usually a really high pH is a symptom of a different problem, like excessive sodium or excessive potassium or something like that. But it's not in and of itself a problem. And I'm talking about, again, peat-based living soil. A pH above about, let's say 7.5, maybe a little higher, maybe 7.7 in a topsoil will I can guarantee you're going to see lower iron uptake, assuming we're talking about an organic system that's not using synthetic chelates. Iron, zinc, manganese availability all go down. You can see that in tissue and sap tests. So again, it's just this pH conversation. Everyone looks at this one chart and freaks and wants to acidify their soil when it's above 7. And I just don't think that's usually necessary.
Yeah, so it's essentially what you're saying is it's just more nuanced than I think.
Yeah, it's very nuanced. It's very nuanced. And for I think most people listening to this, it's we're growing in peat-based living soils. Maybe not entirely. There's also topsoil growers. There's probably some hydro growers too. And so you really want to know how to interpret it based on your system, your media.
Yeah, I think because for hydro growers, chem growers, like they already have this pretty dialed in for their media. They usually know pretty closely where they're at with pH. But on the organic side, especially with living soil, people don't always test their pH, or they get a test back on a soil report, through Logan or another lab. And sometimes that number is quite shocking relative to what they expect to see. So let's say the test comes back at 7.3, their plant looks good. They didn't realize their pH was so high, and now they're, like you said, maybe overreacting and trying to acidify things beyond what they may need to do for the health of their plants. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah. And I also think knowing the pH is helpful. I'm thinking of wolastanite. What a great input. Least expensive source of silica, allowed in organic production. But you want to know your pH, because if you're already at 7.5, you don't want to be dosing wolastanite. If you're at 5.5, I would be recommending both lime and wolastanite. Lime being faster acting, wolastanite a little slower. But you want to, I'd be trying to quickly increase the pH. But if it's like 5.9 or 6, then I would just do wolastanite. So sometimes the pH just sort of helps inform what sources of calcium and silica you're using as well.
Yeah, I do think, though, for living soil growers, this idea, I think we've talked about this before, so the argument is microbes buffer the pH in organic systems in living soils. pH doesn't matter. The plant takes care of it itself. How would you push back on that? I know we've kind of talked about this before.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is, okay, try to then start with a soil with a pH of 5, and tell me how well the microbes buffer that. See how your plants are doing. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say is there is buffering. It's not that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But That's a very categorical statement yeah, I guess I would stick to my first comment. Try to grow in a really low pH environment and see how that goes. It's not going to go very well. I do think that it's not that the microbes buffer the pH at high pHs, but they're still able to mineralize at high pHs and create some nutrient availability. So it's not necessarily that they're changing the soil solution pH. They are a little bit in the rhizosphere, but it's that they're still able to solubilize the nutrients that are needed for the plant at high pHs. So that is somewhat accurate. The other thing I'd say is there is a biological element to it, but a lot of this is just straight chemistry. So if you take iron and you put it in a high pH environment, it'll oxidize, and that's independent of any microbial activity that might be along with that iron. So there's just straight chemistry that happens that can't just be erased.
I look at it from the perspective of how do we make it as easy as possible for a plant to uptake nutrients. And so if we can hit a pH range where nutrients are more accessible, the plant's going to have to work a lot less to try and access nutrients. It's going to be less stressed. You're just going to have a happier, healthier plant. And as an organic, living soil grower myself, we don't have a lot of tools to measure fertility outside of soil and tissue and sap testing. But if we're seeing an issue, we want to figure out what's going on in that moment before we just start applying, fertility or products randomly to try and fix the issue. Testing EC and testing pH and testing moisture levels of our soils are really the only tools I can think of off the top of my head that we can really use to get a gauge of what's going on. And sometimes I will find that is enough of a smoking gun to point us in the right direction. Say, oh wow, our EC is so high. You've applied way too much fertility. Maybe we need to do a light flush, or maybe we need to look at ways to address that. Or your pH is way too low. That could be what's creating some of this issue. Or in the case of moisture, like you said, like we can just look at it and say, you're chronically dry or chronically wet, and that's going to impact things.
Right. And the conversation with pH, I'm sort of going back to the idea that in a living soil system, you don't have to worry about pH. I do agree that there are two things I see growers do quite frequently, which is pH their water when it's not necessary. Sometimes it is, there's no doubt. But I think I see a lot of people pHing water when it's not necessary. That's the first thing. And the reason for that, by the way, is sometimes the pH of your water combined with your soil will actually, the soil can buffer the pH of the water if the alkalinity is not high, if there's not a lot of pressure from minerals in that water. So you can have a pH of 8. You can RO your water and still have a pH of 8. But if you drop 1 grain of organic acid in that water, it'll plummet. So the point is when that water enters the soil, it's going to get buffered and reflect the soil. So people pH their water when it's not necessary, and often create more problems than if they just applied the water unacidified. I'll also add as a tangent that I think people RO their water unnecessarily as well. So the key is you really need to get a water test of your raw, unfiltered water that's not going through any filters, not going through any water softeners, no RO, and see what it looks like before you make a decision on whether to RO or acidify your water. So that's the first thing. And I actually forgot the second thing I was going to say.
Well, while you're thinking about that, I do want to touch on it. So I would agree with you for the most part, but one thing I would push back on a little bit is with facilities or people growing in markets that are very highly regulated for heavy metals. I think you're almost forced into RO water for the reason being that a lot of water contains very low levels of heavy metals, arsenic, cadmium, lead, typically, that are allowed in that meets EPA standards for what we can drink, because we can only drink so much water in a day. But when you apply them to a crop that's getting hundreds of gallons throughout a flower cycle, and you're reusing your media, potentially over time, that could lead you to a fail. So that's where we really encourage growers to test their water to the tightest standards possible, using ICP to really make sure that they have very, very clean water. But also, what do we need to know on a water test, I think is important, because we're telling people to test their water. My brain went to heavy metals. Yours went to pH and chemistry. What do
Yeah,
people really need to know?
mine, because I'm primarily focused on nutrient management, I'm thinking about nutrition, both the essential nutrients, their balance, as well as non-essential, non-beneficial, sort of harmful nutrients. So the first thing that I see as a major issue is sodium, a large sodium contribution, which again is sometimes from people softening their water. Someone puts a water system that is exchanging calcium and magnesium, which are plant nutrients, for sodium. So sometimes you see almost no calcium and no magnesium and really high sodium, and that 100% of the time that's a water softener. So, but sometimes just there's high sodium in well water. Sometimes there's just high sodium in municipal water because the municipality is softening it. So to me, that's the biggest issue. And either you stop using the water softener, or if it's a natural source, you kind of have to RO. I haven't found a good solution besides that. Excessive chloride can be a problem. Excessive boron can actually be an issue, especially in well water. So you kind of have to be careful of the excesses that, again, are being contributed over time in the same way that you're talking about heavy metals. And then I'm looking at pH and alkalinity. So they're two slightly different things, but if the alkalinity is really high, let's say 300 parts per million, it does mean that's going to influence what the roots see, the pH that the roots see. So if the alkalinity is high, you may need to reduce the pH a little bit. And then sometimes I'll see really, really high levels of magnesium, which I don't like, because over time you're going to be pushing the balance of cations towards magnesium and reducing the uptake of calcium, potassium. But otherwise, that's primarily, I'd say that's primarily what I'm looking at on a water test. Having really high calcium doesn't bother me as long as the alkalinity is somewhat reasonable. Having high pH doesn't bother me as long as the alkalinity is low. It's really the excesses that we want to avoid, because over time those just magnify.
You brought up sodium and chlorides. Let's talk about those two, because they're kind of, I think, hotter topics on the soil testing side. Pretty straightforward with sodium, I feel like, but let's remind listeners why sodium is bad from a plant perspective or soil health perspective.
Sodium doesn't do anything physiologically in the plant. It's not an essential nutrient for plants to grow. It's also not a beneficial nutrient, so you just don't want it. The reason it's not good for plants is it increases the salinity in the soil solution, making it harder for plants to uptake water with no benefit. So other nutrients do that too, but there's a benefit. The plants actually need them to grow. Sodium is just making it harder for plants to uptake water with no benefit. And the effect on osmotic stress is very high compared to other ions. So sodium is just doesn't help in any way. The problem is it can be in really high quantities in certain composts and certain worm castings and different inputs when they're applied in excess. And so in a system where you're reusing your media over and over again, which I'm a huge fan of, I believe everyone should be doing that in most contexts, the sodium can get really, really high. And in those instances, you can really start to affect the underlying yield and plant health. And oftentimes with high sodium, it's not obvious. It's sort of this weight that's just kind of like weighing on your yield potential. And maybe you see some visual symptoms if it gets really high, but most of the time it's sort of this invisible drag on your yield.
Yeah, when we look at EC, electrical conductivity, it's a measure of sort of the fertility of the soil. But with sodium, we don't see that. We don't know what percentage of that is sodium, which is not contributing fertility. It's just making it harder for the plant to access the fertility is there. So some of these tools that I mentioned earlier, like testing EC, come with limitations that I think the sodium is one of the big reasons that we need to actually get a real soil test if we are trying to understand exactly what's going on in our soil. I will add the one good thing with sodium is it's fairly leachable
Right.
relative to other minerals. So I don't know if you want to touch on
Well,
that.
yeah, and let me that's actually a good point. The growers who should be most aware of sodium, I mean, everyone should be, because we're getting inputs from all over the place. But in arid climates that haven't had thousands, tens of thousands of years of high precipitation, the sodium hasn't necessarily leached out of the ground. So people who are in dry states that get less than about 30 inches of rain per year should be aware of high sodium, because the compost in the area, the even the hay and the straw you might be bringing into your operation, all of those things actually are going to have higher sodium than in a wet climate where it rains, because over time in these wet areas, all the sodium's leached out. So there's very little sodium pressure. Now, the other thing I'll make people aware of is ocean-based inputs often have high sodium, just because the sodium in the seawater. But for the most part, like well water with high sodium would be in an arid place: Oklahoma, Colorado, Arizona, Texas, those types of places. And that's because of what you're saying, Tad, is it's leachable. So if you get tons of rainfall, it's just going to flush it way down deep out of the top 20 feet of soil.
I'm really glad you brought up compost, because I'd forgotten about that. Honestly, we were working actually together on a project in Australia, and sourcing worm castings or compost, everything they could get access to locally in this location, this region in Australia, was super high in sodium. And coming from the Pacific Northwest, it was just not something I'd ever had to deal with before. We get such heavy rains, like sodium is never a problem around here.
Right. And that's a classic example of why Coots mix works great in some places and not others.
Way to bring it all back. Cool. Well, let's talk about chlorides now, because I know that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I have a lot of people that will get a soil test back, and they'll be 300 or up to, if we talk specifically about Logan tests, they max out at 450 ppm for chlorides. When people get these results, sometimes I hear, oh, but my plants look okay, or I have no idea where the chlorides came from. Why does it matter? And what are the sources for chlorides that people should be aware of?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the sources that I can think of. I can think of 5 sources of chlorides that are consistent. The first is kelp meal. I mean, most people aren't using
by order of most contaminating down, just
sure.
to make it a little more interesting.
Let's do that. Well, okay. So but we'll start with kelp meal. Kelp meal, a long time ago, I tested about 10 different organic amendments and did the entire nutrient profile as well as sodium and chloride in ppms. And the ppms of the kelp meal were 113,000, which is equivalent to 11% chloride. So kelp meal was 11% chloride, which is by far the highest of any input. So if you're using it, I mean, so there's the concentration and then how much you're actually using. So if you're using kelp meal in high quantities, you are providing a lot of chloride. Most people aren't because of heavy metal concerns. But that can be a major issue. The second I would say would be, I've seen castings with really, really high levels, but typically the really high levels of chloride are also with really high levels of nitrogen, really high levels of all nutrients. It's just a hot super concentrated source of worm castings. I used, when I was growing cannabis probably 5 years ago, I top dressed with a casting product that was new to me, hadn't tested it. And I like way overfed my plants pretty far into their life cycle. And when I finally tested it, it was extremely high in everything, including chlorides. So I actually think if you're not careful and judicious about your source of castings, or I guess I should say compost too, but castings can be more concentrated. Usually compost is produced in larger, in such bulk that it kind of dilutes any really, really high nutrient levels. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but castings, if you think about like a homemade castings, you can put so many food scraps and so much, just everything in a very small container, a box, and really concentrate nutrients and chloride. So kelp, castings. The next would be fishbone meal. So I know that, Tad, I know you guys have used fishbone meal, but I've moved away from fishbone meal. About 5 years ago, I started replacing fishbone meal with bone meal. You get a little more phosphorus, a little less nitrogen, fewer micronutrients, but a lot cleaner in terms of sodium and chloride. So fishbone meal was like 2% chloride in the test that I took a long time ago. So pretty high. Again, that's just from the ocean. I'll also just add that chloride is a plant nutrient. You really don't want it in excess, but it's a very important plant nutrient that is rarely deficient. The plant has a really easy time taking up chloride. If it's 20 ppm on a paste test, it's more than enough. But it's different than sodium in that respect. And then after fishbone meal, fish meal as well. Actually, fish meal would be slightly worse than fishbone meal. The reason fish bone meal is a little worse is usually you're applying it in a higher quantity than fish meal. Fish meal would be applied for nitrogen. Fish bone meal, you're trying to build your phosphorus levels typically. And then crustacean meal, like crab and crustacean meal, is also about 2% chloride. So anything from the ocean, it's just reflecting the ocean environment. All of these things can be really good if applied in small quantity, but when you apply them in large quantity over and over again, you can start to see chloride build up, especially when there's not a lot of water running through the soil profile. So if you're not watering to runoff, if you're not leaching, if the water that goes into your soil, if none of it's coming out of your soil system, then over time that stuff starts to build up. And then, like I said, compost typically, even in arid environments, it's hard to know because compost can be used at 5% of a mix or 30% of a mix. And that really makes a big difference. And the quality of compost varies dramatically. So it's tough to order that one, but I would typically put that one at the bottom. And then I guess if I could add one more, it'd be water. You got to be careful in certain environments of water.
I was hoping you were going to throw water in there. I would throw cocoa coir in there for sodium too. Potentially, they've gotten better at washing it. Which is a high water usage cost from a sustainability perspective to get cocoa coir to where it's clean enough that you can grow in it like that. But that's another one to be aware of.
Yeah, and as cocoa mineralizes, like slowly, even peat and cocoa break down very slowly, but the microbes digest them. And as cocoa is mineralized, it'll release a little bit of sodium as well.
Yeah, I haven't moved over to bone and blood meal on our recommendations, primarily because of we talked about a little bit. I filled you in about my conversations on social media with, I'll just say it with Build a Soil about, the cleanliness of these products. A lot of people are afraid of using blood and bone meal and slaughterhouse products because they're worried about antibiotics and GMOs and things like that. Obviously the ethics around the way that these animals are treated is horrific. This is a waste product of those industries. I know some people will ethically just want to avoid them altogether, just based on the stance. But one of the things that we've also talked about is, that I mentioned in that conversation is, fishing is a horrible industry, equally awful industry, what we're doing to the oceans and bycatch, and it is bad. I don't think these animals are treated any better in the ocean as they are land-based animals. And then lastly, a lot of the seed-based fertilizers that are supposedly cleaner are grown using these exact animal manures, in fact, which are, we're demonizing the meat industry, but yet it's what's fertilizing the crops that we're using for fertilizers like alfalfa and things like that.
Well, and
In many
if you
cases
trace
too.
the phosphorus supply chain, the phosphorus in manure is coming from mined phosphorus that's applied on, big farm fields in the Midwest, and then corn, and then the grain is fed to the animals, which then poop out a high phosphorus manure, which, so it was like conventional phosphorus at some point that was mined that ends up in pretty high impact crops, let's call them, that end up in manure. So and actually I through my I have to get continuing education credits to be a certified crop advisor. And one of the sessions was fascinating. It was like, here are the hot spots in the world where phosphorus comes from. And then it shows how it's distributed all over the world through grain and through animals. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. It's just a tangent.
No, I think that's interesting. And I'm not trying to get into that whole debate. I just wanted to mention why people have this idea that ocean-based inputs are cleaner, which is one of the reasons we still make recommendations using fish and fish bone. But I think if more growers were open to using some of these animal byproducts like bone meal, like you're using, it does make it easier to manage chlorides among other things.
Yeah, much easier in my opinion. But I mean, obviously, everyone has a wildly different context and perspective and set of ethics. So that's what I recommend. But people are free to choose what they want to do.
And there are other ways to get phosphorus, and maybe that's worth a quick.
Yeah, let's talk about that, because that's actually tricky organically. I mean, you've got soft rock phosphate, but it's not very available, especially in a pH of 7 or 7.5, and there's heavy metal concerns for sure.
You have to apply pretty high rates of it because
yes, exactly,
in phosphorus.
Now, the lucky thing is, I think phosphorus has been overapplied in cannabis production for a long time. I mean, I think this comes from previous cultivation systems that are using salt-based mixes, but I rarely see low phosphorus on tissue tests and sap tests.
You do see it on paste tests quite a bit, though, in organic systems.
Yeah, but I created the level of what's sufficient, and so it's sort of like that. That's an arbitrary target. I mean, it's like, should we be lowering that target? I look at the standard test now, and my target on the standard test is 1,500 pounds per acre of phosphate, P2O5. You have to be careful about what they're reporting in, because sometimes Logan reports in ppm of phosphorus, which is a 4x difference in the units in the scale. But 1,500 pounds per acre of phosphate, I've never seen a phosphorus deficiency at that level, which means that in probably most systems, you could run it quite a bit lower and be just fine. I just think a luxury level of phosphorus, and I think you've interviewed some researchers that have shown that luxury levels of phosphorus are an economic problem and an environmental problem, but they're not a plant health problem. Like, cannabis can tolerate really high phosphorus levels. Another reason I think it's been overapplied historically. So the point is luckily, I don't think that's a major limiting nutrient in these living soil systems. I think as long as it's in there, the microbes cycle it into availability. And because the initial mixes have such high levels of compost, but also, alfalfa meal, bone meal, all these different inputs, all of those have some phosphorus in them as well. So I think there ends up being a pretty good amount most of the time. But to go back to your question, yeah, you've got fish bone meal and bone meal. You've got soft rock phosphate. You have trace amounts in all the other carbon-based inputs. And, some people have used bone char, but again, it's sort of just a different iteration of bone meal. And
guanos.
Right. Gosh, those have
which
really gone out of style.
thank goodness. Not a fan personally. Though for a while there, every time I saw a soil test with high available phosphorus, I knew the grower was either using guanos or they were using phosphoric acid
Well,
to lower
phosphoric
their
acid. So
water.
this is what I mean by the tendency for people to over acidify. It's so easy. It's like I look at a paste test and it has like 75 ppm of phosphorus. It's like, okay, pH down. And then you look at the water and it's not even a necessary input. And so you're just hammering phosphoric acid for no, it's well, usually it wouldn't be negatively affecting the plant. It's just an unnecessary step in the cultivation. And so the idea biologically is that phosphorus can be cycled quite efficiently, but it's tough to get mycorrhizae to even establish in a high phosphorus environment because that's one of their ecological roles. So when they see high phosphorus, they just don't need to actually colonize. And that it's the idea is that like microbes can get kind of lazy in their functional role. This applies to nitrogen fixers as well. In a high nitrogen environment, you're not going to have a lot of nitrogen fixing bacteria, for example. So we're relying on all of this insoluble, complex carbon-based phosphorus to get cycled biologically. And so when you said phosphorus inputs, I wanted to say, different microbial phosphorus solubilizing microbes, but that's not actually, those are just cycling it once it's there. We're talking about actually getting it into the soil. I just want to make a distinction there.
Yeah, what I thought of when you were talking about that is when I first started my cultivation journey, um, I learned mycorrhiza equals phosphorus. I learned that cover crops like clover, with rhizobium, rhizobacteria equals nitrogen. Um, we learn these things as if they are set in stone when there's actually a lot of nuance to it. Like you mentioned, this idea that, the plant won't seek out a mycorrhizal infection or colonization with high levels of available phosphate. It doesn't need it. So it doesn't do it, even though that mycorrhizal infection creates a symbiosis that also allows for other nutrient assimilation, reduction of drought stress, greater surface area on the roots. Like it has a ton of different benefits, but we have to be thoughtful about, and I guess more knowledgeable about our cultivation practices. With rhizobacteria, you mentioned nitrogen. Well, running a cover crop of clover probably isn't giving us nitrogen if we already have nitrogen, high nitrogen or sufficiency that we're applying through other amendments or compost. So
yeah, I mean,
that's a
it's
good point.
just funny thing. I mean, I use clover extensively as a cover crop. White clover, Dutch white, red clover, yellow clover, and I love pulling it up and I just look at the nodulation. And sometimes the nodulation is like non-existent. I'm like, oh wow, it's a huge clover crop and no nodulation whatsoever. And then sometimes I'll pull up specifically yellow clover. I don't know why. Maybe this is a species specific thing, but I'll pull up yellow clover and see it's like there's fertilizer hanging off the roots. It's unbelievable. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of variability for sure. I was also just thinking, going back to the pH chart being kind of wrong, that it says the classic pH chart says there's practically no phosphorus availability in slightly alkaline soils. Well, that's just not, obviously in our systems, we don't see that to be true at all. I have really good phosphorus availability at pH of 8. And, a lot of these soils, 7.2, really good phosphorus uptake. So in a biologically driven system, that's just not the case. Now, chemically, sure, if you put it in a liquid solution, that may be true. It also doesn't account for like precipitating out of solution so there's just a lot of nuance to those charts, and I don't think people should necessarily take the phosphorus line on those charts very seriously.
I think that's a good point. In relation to your clover comment, I was thinking about how those nodules that you're looking at doesn't necessarily mean you have available nitrogen yet. That still has to be broken down and released, as I understand it.
Yeah, the clover would have to die.
Yeah. I
Or
think that's something people don't always realize too.
for sure. Yeah. Or I mean, technically a perennial clover sloughs off. So the roots, like it'll like throw off roots and then it makes it available. But most of the time the clover actually has to be terminated in a production system for sure. And in fact, my white clover crop was seeded too thickly and has become a bit competitive. So I actually think while it's alive before it sloughs off roots, it's actually competing and probably uptaking more nitrogen than it's releasing. And organic nitrogen, while it's the best from a plant health standpoint, is slow. So even even if the clover does die, it's not gonna pack a big punch. It's a very slow releasing form of nitrogen that takes a lot of time, which is what you want truly when it comes to like building true soil health. You want things to mineralize slowly like that with a really high carbon to nitrogen ratio, but it also means it's slow. So I think people give legumes too much nitrogen credit in general in the scenarios we're working in.
Yeah, I mean, I like clover aesthetically. I like clover as a insect attractant. I hate clover when I have to manually turn it over in, say, a raised bed in my garden. I did that one time. I'm never doing that as a cover crop again because it sucks. I think it makes sense in larger outdoor systems. I wouldn't want to mess with it indoors, as we've talked about in the past. Like right now, I got some clones in that had thrips on them. The last thing I would want to do is add a clover crop in there that would give them further habitat as I'm trying to deal with them with beneficial and oil-based sprays and things like that. So
I do think the outdoor cultivators, there is a lot of potential for just a really quick fall cover crop. I think rye. I think annual rye is like the best cover crop in the world. It's just so universal. It, as long as you can, the hardest part is finding the time after harvest to get out in your field and actually seed it. But if you can stand up a cover crop of rye, I think that just like really, really helps. I mean, and then obviously you'd be terminating it with a tillage pass before planting the next season. But I think that any annual crop that's harvested in the fall and replanted in the spring, 100%, I think a cover crop is a low-hanging opportunity. But yeah, I mean, indoor, totally different context.
do you want to touch on mustard since we're talking a little about cover crop or mustard meals?
Oh, interesting. Mustard.
I have a ton
So
on that.
I stay away from mustards. They can be strongly allelopathic. They put out these compounds. I forget the name of them, but they're these sulfur-containing compounds that really suppress the growth of a lot of other plant species. I don't think they are symbionts with mycorrhizae, so you're not getting that effect. You're not like keeping your mycorrhizae alive. I don't use mustard in cover crops. I think it could be used effectively in certain situations, but I actually work with a grower. There's an old orchardist who took me to his orchard, and he had like an acre. The corner of his orchard was just dead. He couldn't get anything to grow, and they had cover cropped with some kind of mustard family like 5 years ago, and they just still couldn't get anything to grow. So from that experience and from the little bit I sort of stay away from it. I don't think it's that strong. I'm probably making it out to be stronger than it is, but I think, I guess if you're trying to sterilize so that when you would want to use mustard is when you're trying to sterilize your soil, when you have a really bad pathogen, or maybe a symphylan or something.
My brain went to symphylan's and root knot nematode, but
Yeah,
pathogens as well. Yeah, because it is
yeah,
such a
yeah.
strong fumigant.
Yeah, so it's a natural, exactly. It's a natural fumigant. You could use it in that context. What I would do is I would go 100% mustard. I'd incorporate it, and then I would inoculate the soil with beneficials, because a
After
lot of these,
termination.
yeah, after termination, a lot of these soil-borne pathogens, they seem to be really strong when they're destroying your crops, but they're actually um, they don't compete that heavily. So if you can get a really diverse, beneficial mix of microbes competing against them, that usually keeps them at bay pretty well. So knocking them down with a mustard fumigate and then re-inoculating with a diverse set of beneficials is the approach I would take.
I see people using it though, for indoor cultivation or to deal with minor pests like fungus gnats or things like that. And I just want to caution folks because yes, if you are dealing with a major issue that there's no other options for, there's no other control agents that we can use, then I think it's a possibility to consider it. But a lot of these things that we talk about could potentially have non-target organism effects. And in the case of mustards, it absolutely does. So you're killing off the whole soil food web when you start applying these things. It doesn't care if it's beneficial or pathogenic.
That's right.
And
That's right.
so
I also,
your
one more
soil, it
comment.
damages soil health. I mean, you have to be very intentional about that.
Yeah, and one more comment on dealing with soil-borne pathogens. All soil biology is in part a function of the soil environment. So sometimes, in addition to maybe growing a mustard, I would try to change the physical components of the soil as well. So I might try to do deep tillage, or I would just try to change up the existing environment. If you have a really, really gnarly soil-borne pathogen, change everything. You're fumigating, you're aerating, and you're re-inoculating. So you're trying to change the entire environment. It's not just about biological competition. It's not just about chemistry either, which is another point. I might try to increase the pH. I might try to change the chemical environment. Just change everything to throw off the whole environment in which the pathogen's thriving in.
Yeah, that's a good point. We want to, if it's successful in a certain environment, you want to change that environment to make it
Exactly.
harder.
That's how I think about it from a high level.
Yeah, I just did a post on social media this last week. The way I've been thinking about cultivation, and this is, I haven't fully thought it out yet, but this idea of, because I was thinking about like who, what, where, when, how, the steps you learn when you write a story. I was like, as a cultivator, I kind of use these same steps because I talk about like, let's be a detective when you walk into a room. What do you notice, before you even touch anything? Like, what do you see in that room? Like, I guess, and again, this is sort of half thought out, but I think about like, what am I applying? Like, why am I applying that? Where am I applying it? Like, all of these things I think are important, and they all come back to like limiting factor of growth. What's the logic behind the action that I'm going to take, or the inaction that I'm going to take, really? Because I think people are so quick to diagnose and react that I think sometimes we need to just take a step back and apply sort of that logic process again. Because, and I do it too as a grower. If I see something in my room, let's just say, in this case, thrips, I have to stop, think about like, what's my best course of action for my specific environment to deal with it, depending on how much canopy I have, what stage of growth I'm in, what environmental parameters do I have in my room. All of those things are going to play a role in how I want to attack this problem, versus just being like thrips and then saying spray, or whatever approach you plan on taking. Sometimes we skip those thought processes, and so I've been trying to think about a thoughtful way to really make a methodology in my head for how I approach these things.
Yeah, I think that's smart. It's like an SOP for reacting. I think that makes sense. I mean, if for an indoor or greenhouse growers, I would always go, my first thought is always environment. So I would like want to like inventory and go through a checklist of my the environmental conditions. Anyway, that just kind of throwing that out there. It also your methodology reminds me of in agronomy. It's called the 4 Rs. So every decision is based on the right source, the right rate, the right time, and the right place. And you sort of think about that every single action you take. I'll also add that in my personal journey as a grower, the overreaction problem has been solved as I've increased the scale of my growing because it takes so long to mobilize to do anything that in that time when I'm getting a product to spray or I'm everything just takes there's more complexity. It forces me to slow down and just take a little bit more time to think about the entire solution set as well as all the repercussions and all the everything, all the variables that go into it.
Yeah, having a child sort of did that for me. I just
yeah, exactly.
My free time was gone, which is great.
I would do this tonight, but I can't. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Like I meant to spray yesterday and I ran out of time, and it'll be okay. I'm just going to adjust my schedule accordingly. But those are the things I think about. But yeah, you brought up the 4 Rs. That's a great point. If people are unfamiliar, they should absolutely read about them. Until you'd brought it up, I'd forgotten about them. Very similar philosophy, because as someone who spends more time than I like on social media, I'm always seeing new products being promoted or new concepts. And I think it's very easy to get caught up in that around thinking that, this is the best approach, or I need to change this, or I need to add this product because I see healthy plants online, which frankly is not a good way to judge any of those things. So I would just caution listeners to really be thoughtful about their approach. And when they see something online that sounds really interesting or compelling, my first question is always, do you need it? And then 2, do you see it in other industries besides the one that you're in? So if we're talking cannabis, does this product exist outside of cannabis? And I'm not saying it has to be broadly used in agriculture. Maybe that doesn't make sense because it's too expensive, but it's still efficacious. But I think that's a good measuring tool.
I have a great example of this that because I followed that same sort of general principle when I heard about under canopy lighting, and I'm like deeply skeptical. You don't really see it very much in other industries. It seems like an unnecessary expense. You sort of question. For a long time I questioned it, and I've actually come around quite a bit. Mm-hmm. But that was a tough one for me because it definitely didn't check out at first until actually I found that the highest I was essentially wrong that it doesn't exist in other industry. The highest yielding tomato greenhouses, the highest yielding cucumber and pepper production, they totally use under canopy lighting. Well, they also use like
intercanopy lighting.
Yeah. They also use heating, like inner canopy heating, with like what they call grow pipes or heat pipes. So when you get into the highest levels of production, I actually did start seeing that, and I thought, oh, okay. And then obviously we had this discussion offline just about the results are there. I think it depends on the context of the operation. How much your canopy is limited, what you're growing for. If the lower flowers really need to, if you're just growing for the best flower and you want 100% of your flower to be the highest quality, then it might make sense to get higher quality down low. So obviously it depends, but that's one that I saw for a long time and was sort of skeptical about it, to be honest.
Yeah, like we did talk about this. I just got back from PhotoX. They did show examples in Europe of tomato and cucumber growers getting very large yields utilizing this methodology. It's very counterintuitive to think that you can light the underside of a leaf and get better results or good photosynthetic potential out of it. But yeah, it does seem to work. And like I said, I'm trialing it right now in my grow to see what it looks like compared to top lighting side by
Mhm.
side. So I'm excited to see what those results look like. But
I think the reason, I mean, if you look at the light distribution through a canopy, it's wild. I mean, you just get so little light at the, even when you de-leaf and try to work with canopy management, there's just a lot of plant parts up high that shade. The other reason though is energy drives evaporation. So if you want evaporation out of the bottom parts of the plant, leaves and flowers, you need energy. You need, and that pulls assimilates into those flowers and helps them size. So it kind of makes sense theoretically. What I was skeptical about is just the economics of it. It's like, okay, you improve the flower size down low, what's that actually worth compared to these, the fairly high capital expenditure of under canopy lighting? But it works for a lot of growers.
yeah, so here's another interesting approach when you talk about sort of capital expense versus yields. One of the larger growers in Canada that I met with at PhotoX was talking about how they push plants very, very hard with high PPFD, 1500 PPFD top lighting only. And so they get a significant amount of photo bleaching. Uh, you know, I don't remember the exact number, 10% might be photo bleach, which doesn't allow them to sell it as flour, but then they can create a milled product out of it, essentially grind it up into something, a blended milled product that can be, catered specifically for bongs or joint rolling or whatever the people are looking at. And that product is actually, that market has grown significantly to where that's a large part of their production method now is this milled product.
Huh.
Which I thought was really interesting. So the yield increase, even with the photo bleaching loss, create an overall net benefit for them because of the amount of photosynthesis that's occurring that's allowing them to get, a larger yield, even if some of that yield is now essentially lost to photo bleaching
Yeah, it's just
in the
funny that
purpose of finished flower.
the highest flowers aren't the highest quality in their case. That's those are their seconds. That's very fast.
Yeah, yeah. So it's an issue that I think the industry is still learning and addressing. I'm curious to see if I get photo bleaching on these lower canopy, under canopy lights on my lower leaves because some of them are pretty close and some of the light's pretty powerful. So
Do you know what the PPFD is on them?
so I think for the because of the way because it's a curved tubular light, it's very hard to get a good
Got it.
PPFD reading on it, but you can look at the overall like PPF output of the light and then sort of calculate from there. If I
Yeah,
got right next to the light an inch away, I'm at 1,000 maybe. But if I'm, inverse square law, as I move further away, it drops pretty dramatically. But,
right.
within 5, 6 inches, I'm probably still 500 ppfd, still pretty high
Right.
relative
What
to the
I've gotten
sun.
real interested in lately too is like, how much can a plant take and what determines that? And a lot of it is like if the stomata are open, it's able to evaporate and cool itself. It can take a lot higher light. It can take, CO2 matters. Obviously, water and nutrition matters. Um, but really, if you can keep your stomata open with good leaf VPD, I think that also just really helps because typically, you can see problems arise when you lose balance in some other variable.
Yeah. Well, I know we've been jumping around today. We've been talking for about an hour on air. Was there anything else that you wanted to cover
No, it's a
before
good
we sign off?
conversation. There's nothing top of mind for me. It's fun to just chat about a number of different topics with you. And again, I appreciate you having me on. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to make it to the conference this year.
Well, hopefully we do it again next year. And maybe if there are listeners listening to this, if there's a particular topic that you'd love to hear Bryant converse on, let me know. Maybe we can do a follow up interview down the road because he's become a regular you become a regular guest on the show. I love having you on. I always learn something, and it's always fun to have these chats. So, yeah, hope we can have you on again soon.
Thanks, Sad.